welcome back to episode number 50 of the Unapologetic Podcast. Jonathan, we did it. We got to 50.
Well, we did something. We got to 50.
Yeah. And, we've been looking forward to this one and trying to come up with what would be a good focus, good topic, good guest to have on. And so we're excited this morning to have Dan Darling with us and going to talk about some different trends, issues, things that we think Christians should pay attention to this coming year in 2026. But Dan, glad to have you. Jonathan, if you want to maybe do a quick handover to Dan before we get started.
Yeah, thankful for Dan being on. Dan, I can't remember, gosh, it was a couple months ago we sat down in Boston. We were at the Evangelical Theological Society meeting and had a chance to probably sit and have our first real conversation. I mean, we've known we know each other. We run in the same circles. Dan works with two really close friends of mine down at Southwestern Seminary, Chandler Snyder, Colby Adams. Actually texting with Colby and Chandler this week about some other things, but we run in similar circles, both Southern Baptists for a long time, both spent time in Louisville, Kentucky at Southern Seminary. And then I just personally have appreciated Dan from a distance on social media and things he's written. Just this kind of, I know people don't like the word winsome. I still like the word winsome. So here's, I think, a winsome, kind, gentle, but convictional thinker. And particularly when it comes to things like cultural engagement, Christians in politics, the gospel, all these things. So really appreciated your work from afar. Appreciated some of the stuff you did when you were at the Ethics and Religious Liberty Commission in Nashville, Tennessee, which if people are watching, maybe don't know what that is. It's how would you describe it, Dan?
I think the public policy arm of the SBC.
Yeah. Yeah, so the public policy arm of the Southern Baptist Convention. So you were there for how long?
Yeah, about 8 years, 8 or 9 years. Yeah.
Yeah, so appreciated what you did there. So thankful for you and just everything you've done. Thankful for things you write. So I just finished In Defense of Christian Patriotism and really enjoyed it. I actually have something written up about it that'll go live later today, but appreciated all the things that you're doing. So thanks for all that you are doing. Thanks for joining us today. If you want to give us any more background of you and your family and what you're doing there in Texas, that'd be great.
Yeah, I'd love to. Yeah, I mean, so family background. Yeah, I've been married for 23 years. Wife Angela, she's from Fort Worth here. So when we moved here to come to Southwestern Seminary, and we moved, I started in 21, but we moved in 22. You know, for her, she hadn't been back to Texas in 25 years. I mean, she hadn't lived in Texas, so for her, it was like coming back to the Republic of Texas. You know. But we have four kids, a college student and a senior in high school, and then a sophomore and a eighth grader. So it's a full house for us. I was born and raised in the Chicago area. I pastored for a while there, and then worked at a Christian organization in writing and editing, and then moved to Nashville to work for the ERLC for a number of years as VP of Communications, and then now I'm at Southwestern Seminary. I lead the Richard Land Center for Cultural Engagement. I don't know if people remember Richard Land, but he was ERLC president for 25 years and really a Southern Baptist statesman, was, you know, in the White House quite a bit when George W. Bush was president, and then also, you know, just represented us very well. And so there's a center here, and, you know, we try to help young people think through moral and ethical issues. There's a faith and culture concentration in the undergrad Texas Baptist College that I teach. If people are just interested in public square, public policy, apologetics, all that kind of stuff. And then we do some events and things to help pastors and equip people that way. But yeah, I mean, awesome. My life has really always been really three loves that I've had. One is a love for the church. I've always felt called to Christian ministry, and love the church, still do, you know, still get excited to go to church on Sunday. And then a love for kind of history and politics and culture. When I was like 10 or 11, our parents drove to Washington, D.C. to take a trip, family trip. This was before the internet, so somehow my mom planned a trip before the internet. I don't know how you do that, but and I was just really captivated, you know, standing at the Lincoln Memorial and seeing the monuments, and just I've always had a love for this country and a love for history and politics, and I've always loved writing. Ever since I was in middle school, had a teacher encourage me to continue to write. So kind of put all those three things together. I've been doing all those things in some form or fashion wherever I am. So that's sort of the calling God's put on my life.
Yeah, I think you talk about that story going to DC when you were younger in your book, and so you started talking. I was like, hey, I think I just read that, but kind of sets the stage for some of what you're doing in this particular volume. Yeah, it's good.
Yeah. Well, before we get into the kind of the things to look forward to in 2026 on the new book, what was the kind of the genesis for deciding, that would be the next thing, and how that, because it's I don't want to say provocative title, but kind of, I think sometimes we don't always step in fully into some of those conversations the way that you did in that one. So what led to writing that one, and just curious for the process?
Well, there's a few things about it. I've always loved the country. I've always been considered myself patriotic. But I think in a few catalysts, I think in number one, America is celebrating her 250th anniversary this year, and there's going to be a lot of conversations about this. But I've really, in the last several years, and you've probably noticed this too, but there's a real, if maybe previous generations, and I'm not even sure this narrative is true, but maybe if previous generations were too patriotic or love their country too much, maybe put it over the mission of God. I don't think that's necessarily true, but that's a accusation that gets made. I think in this generation, it's really the opposite. I think there's a real cynicism about the country. There's a real hesitance, even for good conservative Bible believing Christians, to say they love the country. If you think on 4th of July every year, people put so many caveats before they say, hey, I'm glad to be an American. They have to recite all the terrible things that we've done as a country, which is kind of an odd thing to do on someone's birthday, right? If I told my wife, happy birthday, even though you've done all these 15 things that are bad, I don't think that would work very well. And there's been a steady stream, and I talk about this in the book, there's been a steady stream in the last 10 to 20 years of really making Christians who love their country or want to be involved in the political process feel guilty, as if it's a form of every time you do that, it's a form of idolatry. Or maybe it's dangerous. It's Christian nationalism. It's you want to establish a theocracy. And so a lot of Christians have been real hesitant, and it only seems to happen, I think, toward conservatives, right? I mean, I think there's, as I outline in the book, progressives are also very politically engaged, and they don't seem to get as much heat in terms of being labeled certain things. So I just want to kind of push back on that and say there is a way to be a Christian and love God first, love the kingdom of God first, of course, but have these other loves underneath that ordered well, as we see, and I borrow from C.S. Lewis and Augustine and Chesterton, and ultimately, I think Jesus. That the conversation is not always a binary one where you have to choose God or country. Sometimes you do, right? Sometimes your country has to do things that violate, your convictions. But most of the time, it's about ordering these things. And I think we can love our country well, love God first, and love our country well. And in fact, I argue that to not love your country, to be ambivalent or even antagonistic, I don't think it's proper for a believer. And I sort of explain why.
Yeah, Dan, you say along those lines, you say a healthy patriotism is not only an acceptable posture for a Christian, but you believe it is a necessary posture for a Christian. So unpack it. Why is it when we use those words, acceptable? Yeah, you can do it. That's fine. Necessary is like this is an ought, right? There's an oughtness to this. Talk about that a little bit.
Yeah, I really believe that way. It's interesting. Richard John Newhouse, who was a great Catholic writer and thinker on the 20th century, he talked about patriotism as a species of discipleship, that it's a requirement. And how I get there is a few places. One, I think it comes out of gratitude, that we understand as Christians, we're not disembodied spirits. We are born into a place with a heritage and a culture. And I think we should have gratitude for the place God has put us, right? If we believe Acts 17, where God appoints people sovereignly in the places and borders where they are, it's about gratitude and saying, I'm thankful and I'm grateful for the place where I'm at. But even more than that, I think about the word that Jeremiah gave to the exiles in Jeremiah 29, where here are Jewish exiles in Babylon, not a place they wanted to be. They're very out of step with everything going on in Babylon. And Jeremiah says to them to seek the welfare, the flourishing, or the shalom of your city. And I think we can relate to that. In 1 Peter, we're called strangers and exiles. We're citizens of the kingdom of God. And yet the word to us is not to just be detached from the place where we are and withdraw, but to seek its welfare. I don't know how you seek the welfare of a city or country that you loathe or that you're ambivalent about. I just don't know how that is possible. And so I really believe it's important for us to think this way. And if you think about it, G.K. Chesterton talked about patriotism this way, and he said, loving the things closer to you helps you love the things that are more abstract, right? Yeah. So you start with the loves closest to you, your family, and you work outward, right? It's kind of easy to sort of love the world in a nebulous way without making it concrete. But what about the people in front of you, the country in front of you?
Yeah.
And so I think that's sort of where
this is an Augustinian idea right there, ordo amoris. People, there was a big discussion of this last year online about, because I think it was the Vice President Vance who actually referenced the ordo amoris, the ordering of loves, and people kind of lost their mind and thought, well, what's he talking about?
We know how to do this, though. It's interesting, and I think he was right. Now, ordo amoris can, ordering our loves means we should still work outward, right? So there's a way in which you can love your country, and you only love your country, and you never, and you love your country at the expense of other countries, or where you're not thinking about the mission of God to love the nations, or you think you're superior. That's a kind of disordered love. But in terms of ordering our loves, I've had people tell me, for instance, Christians tell me, good people say, oh, I couldn't say the Pledge of Allegiance to the United States because we're only supposed to pledge allegiance to Christ. And I say, well, we can have lesser allegiances, right? 23 years ago, I pledged allegiance to my wife, right? Now, the pastor didn't say to me, hey, Dan, you either have to choose pledging allegiance to Christ or your wife, but you can't do both. No, what he said was, if Christ is your highest allegiance, you're actually going to love your wife in a proper way, right? When they're in that right ordering. And we do this in other areas, right? I mean, if you think about it, I pledged allegiance every month to my cell phone provider and my mortgage company. And those allegiance don't supersede my allegiance to Christ. They shouldn't, but they are underneath there. And I think that's how we should think about it. And sometimes they get out of order. We can have disordered loves. And actually, when our love for Christ is supreme, we love the lesser things better. We don't expect them to be more for us than they're meant to be, right? If I worship my wife and she's my highest allegiance over Christ, I'm actually going to expect her to be for me, but only Christ can be. And I won't be a good husband. Or same with my children. If my children are my everything, then I won't be a good father because I'm going to expect them to do for me, but only Christ can. And same with my country. If I put my country in the place of Christ, every election, I'm going to be despondent and hopeless if we lose or things don't go our way, or I'm not going to have a realistic view of what can be done in this earth. But if I have it in the proper ordering, I can love my country in a way that's healthy.
Yeah. One of the things that you pointed out, kind of getting back to the reason for this type of conversation, you provided some statistics that were really kind of jarring, not surprising, but just to see them on a page, it was like, man, that's just unfortunate. 39% of Americans are extremely proud of their country. You break that down then by generation. 50% of those aged 55 and over are extremely proud. Then it just goes down. 40% of those aged 35 to 55, and a meager 18% of those aged 18 to 20. So I think that speaks to the need for this conversation, because we have a culture that is discipling a generation of young people to say, hey, you should loathe, you should lament, you should not celebrate where you're from, celebrate America, but you should disdain almost. So that we have a generation of believers, even Christians, that are hearing this type of narrative, and you're writing to say, hey, no, you don't have to do that. You can be thankful for this place that hasn't always lived up to what you say, the ideals. So unpack that a little bit. It's like you're not whitewashing history.
No,
you're not saying America's great and there are no black eyes. But you are saying that when those atrocities in the past, with slavery, abortion, those types of things that happened, those were things that didn't live up to the highest ideals of the United States of America. Talk about that idealism that you mentioned in the book.
Yeah, I think you're right. And I think part of the reason that there's such cynicism and lack of patriotism is, when America is all you see are the problems, right? And there's a sort of a lack of historical awareness of, as many problems as we have in this country, how good we have it historically. And even if you travel around the world, sometimes I look at these statistics and I just think these people need to go on a few mission trips, and just get some perspective. But I do think, in terms of history, and I have a whole chapter in the book on how to think about American history, because I think there's really two wrong ways to do it. I think one way is to sort of whitewash history and say, these things really didn't happen, or they weren't as bad as we think, or whatever, or to do like the 1619 Project does and sort of pull one strand from that history and say, this is the whole story, right? That America's was solely founded only to subjugate people and only for slavery and white supremacy, and there's no other redeeming values, which is just historically not true, but a deeply cynical view of the country. And I think the way we should look at it is to say, America is a really good country that has committed sins, and that we should not, forget or whitewash. But what we can celebrate are America's ideals. This idea of all men are created equal, the consent of the governed, this grand experiment in human history. And where we have fallen short, we've fallen short of our own ideals, right? And we still have not fully lived that out, right? Because we're in a fallen world, in a broken and fallen world. We also have to look at America in context to say, yes, we have committed these things, but let's look at the history of every single country, and where do we stack up compared to that? And I think one of the things I try to express here is, if you really care about injustice, the way to fight injustice is not with cynicism, but actually with some idealism. America's greatest social reformers loved the country. I mean, Frederick Douglass's speech, "What to the Slave is the 4th of July," he reveres the founders, and he says this is a great experiment. These men were wise men, but we just have not lived up to what we say we are. Can we do that? Martin Luther King did that. Abraham Lincoln did that, right? We're doing that when we march for the sanctity of life. We're saying, if all men are created equal, even unborn people should be part of that social contract. If you don't have that national pride, that rallying cry, that creed or whatever, then there's no central organizing thing about which to get people motivated to make social change, right? Yeah. I actually think cynicism is pretty easy and lazy. Everything's terrible. I could just check out, right? And so I don't think that's very, very helpful. And I really talk about in the book, about how to think about our history, and how do we think about history as Christians? And history is a story of fallen people, right? How does the Bible tell history, right? If you look at Hebrews 11, and it talks about the heroes of the Old Testament, Um, the writer of Hebrews is not whitewashing the history of David's sins and Abraham's sins and all these people, but it's saying, here's the whole story, right? Good and bad, and how God worked sovereignly through history.
Yeah, that's good. Well, the book is fantastic. I'll end with kind of one kind of thing on it, and then turn. I know Brandt's got some other places he wants to go. Really enjoyed the book. Thanks for writing. One of the things that you kind of remind us in the book, the reader, is that as we're engaging in the public arena today, and I don't mean on CNN or necessarily debating politics, it's just you're engaging with your neighbor. Yeah, you're engaging with people you're at work with. And we live in an age where we're divided in a lot of ways. And some say we're divided more than ever. And that's debatable. But there's division and there's disagreement. But you remind us to kind of remember that the person you disagree with, the person on the other side of the issue is still a human being created in the image of God.
Right.
And we should treat
weight
them.
of glory, right?
Yeah. So, I mean, we should treat them appropriately. We should treat them like those. Even Calvin, I mean, in Calvin's Institute, he talks about his enemies and how you should treat your enemies. And he says you should remember first that they bear the image of God. And so I think that's true. But the question I had for you, and then we can shift to Brandt, is there are some people bearing the image of God, creating the image of God of equal worth and value in terms of their personhood, and yet some of the issues are so wicked today. Is there a place for, and I'm going to borrow kind of a phrase that people debate, a serrated edge in how we address some of even the people that are on some of the most wicked sides of some policies out there? I'm thinking child mutilation, the transgenderism, that sort of thing. Yeah. And what does that look like? Because that's something I really genuinely wrestle with. Because I've got friends on both sides of those issues who, they champion the serrated edge, and others champion winsomeness, and I'm in the middle and trying to navigate some of those things in my own head.
Well, that's a great question. I do first of all think, and I argue in the book, that Christians should be engaged in these issues and should not be afraid to, as First Peter says, have an answer for every person for the hope that lies within us. I mean. Yeah. We have the truth, and people are asking questions today. What does it mean to be human? What does it mean to be male and female? We should stand up against wickedness, right? And even more so, I think, as American Christians, because unlike many people in human history, or maybe even many people today around the world, we actually have agency. We have more agency than people that Paul was writing to in the New Testament. We have a voice. We have a vote. And we can speak up, and now we can't change everything, and sometimes we're disappointed, but we can do some good. And I think we should stand up against wickedness and use strong language and not be afraid to do that. If you look at, historically through, great social reformers and even in Scripture with the prophets, I think strong language and standing up is really important. I also think the language we use should be distinctly Christian, right? I think the New Testament has a lot of passages in there about the way that we speak. I mean, think of Peter, right? Peter was no shrinking violet. Here's the one who was willing to kill a soldier that was arresting Jesus. He preached on Pentecost. He's willing to go to jail for his faith, and tradition says that he was martyred for his faith, crucified upside down. And yet he says in 1 Peter, have an answer for every person for the hope that lies within you, but do it with gentleness and kindness. And so I think there's a distinct way of doing it, that courage and civility are not enemies. They're friends. Now, where the standards are, sometimes that could be shifting. What to some person looks like, to some people, any kind of speaking into the culture or speaking against these things is considered, that's culture wars. We shouldn't be doing that. We're going to offend people. And, I think that's a wrong approach, right? The gospel itself is offensive. And sometimes by speaking out, we've seen in the last couple of years, by speaking out, particularly on the Christian sexual ethic, it actually becomes an apologetic that invites people into the Christian faith, because they say, man, I've been looking everywhere and nothing makes sense here. I think the sexual revolution isn't working. Man, Christianity has a comprehensive worldview on this stuff. So I don't think we should be afraid to do that. On the other hand, other people look and say, unless you are, all day constantly being, a jerk to people, then you're
Yeah.
not prophetic, right? And I don't think that tracks either, right? I think Peter is saying we encourage in civility. And I do think it's different for every person, right? Some people in their disposition don't like conflict. And so to them, I think Peter's word is you need to have more boldness and not be afraid of what people think. You need to say what's true and right.
That's good.
Even be afraid of losing social status if you need to. To other people, they love the fight. As Francis Schaeffer said, they love the smell of blood. And to them, I think Peter's saying, you be careful the way you interact. So I just really think we have to be wise and make sure that we're following Scripture, not in just what we're saying in the content, but really in how we conduct ourselves. But, it's a little bit subjective sometimes in terms of what to you or me might seem offensive might not be to someone else. But I do think there are some lines that it's like, okay, we all know that this is not the way to conduct ourselves.
It's been helpful.
Great question.
Thanks, Dan.
It's a constant. I mean, I'm thinking of it of we should constantly be contending for not just the gospel, but also for truth.
Mm-hmm.
Yet at the same time, losing isn't ultimate for us. So I think that's one of the things that I do notice a lot of times, more so on the progressive side, but even some of the urgency that you might see from the very conservative, right side is, losing is we can't lose. And I think, a better perspective is like, oh, yeah, we might lose. That doesn't, and that's not the end. Like that doesn't, losing a political fight or losing a fight over an issue that impacts how people live in the United States is not an ultimate thing.
Mm-hmm.
Like that should not shake our faith. That should not stop us from contending. I think sometimes winning is the ultimate for a lot of people. And that's why the stakes feel so high.
Yeah.
Well, and that sort of bleeds into one of the other things we're going to want to talk about of a 2026 issue is, one of the ways that we, look out for the welfare of our city, as Jeremiah writes that you mentioned, Dan, is, we vote and we elect people that create laws that set trajectory, that create, circumstances and settings where we live a certain way. And so, 2026 is a midterm election with, stakes are always high, but there are particular things sort of at stake this time with a very divided Congress with narrow margins of what laws are going to get passed by each side. And so as you've looked ahead to this year and what that could entail, what are some of the things that you're paying attention to as far as what's at stake? And we've already talked about this, but maybe reemphasizing that, Christians can't disengage from this conversation. Like we need to be voting. We need to be paying attention to the issues that are each side's going to be promoting, each candidate's going to be promoting. But yeah, within the context of, Christian worldview and things that we should look at for 2026, how are you thinking about, the midterms, which are going to be a year-long thing?
Yeah, they will be. And, it's really interesting. First of all, I every Christian has a different, I think every Christian should be engaged in some level in public square. I think with our citizenship is a stewardship. Romans 13, holds people in power accountable. And I think in a government like ours, where we share the power, we're going to be held accountable just as much, maybe not as much, but we will be held accountable just like the people in public office who have these positions. And if we love our neighbors as ourselves, as we're commanded to do, I think we should weigh in on the policies that affect our neighbors' flourishing. So we should be engaged. Christians are going to disagree on some of the finer details on some policies, like, how do we, whether it's economics or some of these other things. But there are certain moral issues that really Christians, I think, have to be strong on, right? When we think about the sanctity of marriage, when we think about gender and sort of the transgender movement that we should oppose, and we think about the sanctity of life, those things really matter. I also think, America's position in the world, I think we can't, America can't be the world's policeman. We can't be everywhere, but America does have a leadership role in the world and what that looks like, in terms of, defending the things that we, Western civilization and those things are things worth voting on. And I think a lot of those things are at stake. There's two very different visions for what the country should be like. And, not everything on the right you may agree with or maybe is good, but I, as someone who has been a conservative my whole life, a sort of Reagan 3-stool conservative my whole life, I think far more of what I believe about Scripture finds itself on the right than on the left. I don't think everything on the left is a bad idea, but a lot of the things that oppose, I think, what America's all about. I think the left just has a very different vision for the country. So I think Christians should be engaged and vote and vote for the best possible candidate that lines up for your values, and know that every time you vote for someone, you're voting for a flawed person who is probably going to have a few things you don't like, a few things that you disagree with, but you make the best decision you can, but do be engaged. Surveys show that turnout in midterms is usually way down compared to presidential elections. But I think we should pay attention to these, and not just the national level, Senate and Congress, which are very important, but local levels, right? The school board and state representatives and state senators. These are important positions, judges, right? I think we should be engaged and involved and vote for the best possible people, because they really affect the policies that affect our neighbors' flourishing. You think about some of the policies in the last few years that have been fairly soft on crime, where, prosecutors have declined to prosecute people who commit violent crimes. Well, those people getting elected actually hurt some of these communities by allowing crime to flourish and become worse. And so, it does really matter who we vote for and how we vote. So I think it's important.
Yeah, I appreciate what you said on the local piece too, because, so many things that used to just be local issues have become nationalized.
Yeah.
And so it feels like there's maybe less weight on local elections. But, I think from my seat as a conservative Christian, there's very little on the progressive left, which has kind of taken over the Democratic Party. Right. So when you're in a two-party system, it becomes pretty hard to find national candidates who end up on a Democratic ticket that are going to provide a worldview that I could feel comfortable voting for. Even if there are economic issues or international relation things where there might be some more middle ground, some of the issues around gender, sexuality, right to life. It's just hard to find.
There's no middle ground.
There's not a lot. And so if you look at when some of those things become nationalized, it's hard to vote for one side over the other. But then if you look at the local side, there are things that I could be behind on local tax issues that are going to support what maybe some on the progressive left would feel are more justice minded. Like, I want to care for the poor in my town. I want to care for the poor in my state. And there may be some things locally, initiatives that come on the ballot that, maybe wouldn't align with a national conservative agenda, but that are going to actually benefit a local community. And you have to pay attention to those things and be willing to split tickets and be willing to have some discernment over what's actually going to benefit the people around you.
Yeah, I agree with that. There's very little on the progressive side that, it's funny. I get asked by journalists all the time, the question we've had for 10 years, which is just really old. Like, how could Christians vote for certain candidates, right?
Yeah.
And I think, well, most Christians don't like everything about that candidate or their life or whatever, but they're not going to vote. Conservative Christians are not going to vote for what the left is offering. It's completely at odds with our worldview. And I agree on the local piece. And one other thing I would say is I really think Christians should get involved in primaries, right? Because primaries are where you can find the best possible candidate that can win. And when you think about things like character and things like all these kinds of stuff, don't wait till the general election to get involved. Get involved in a primary and to be able to shape the best possible candidate, I think is really important.
Well, and even Missouri is an interesting case as an open primary state. Like, you could look at someone who's like, okay, so this is maybe someone who's going to fall under a Democrat ticket, but if there's someone who's actually a pro-life, Second Amendment, you could actually influence that on a open primary to say, I want this
Or
person.
maybe you have multiple candidates who have very similar views
Yeah.
as a conservative, but you're saying, this guy has a little bit more experience, or this guy has a little bit more, I like his character, his family, but like you have more of a choice sometimes. Not always. Sometimes you're just saying, okay, it's the best of not a great cast. But anyways, I do think Christians should be involved. I think it really matters.
I think one of the things that you got to do for the normal Christian on the ground is when we talk about these things and being involved, it's not merely being involved in who's going to be in the House of Representatives, right?
Mm-hmm.
When we talk about being involved in your local community, it's like, do you know what's going on in your school system?
Yeah.
Are you involved
Right.
do you go to school board meetings? Do
Mm-hmm.
you go to city council meetings? I mean, my hometown back in Kentucky, I kid you not, they're all over the news, the national news. It's all over. It's all over social media. The city council and the mayor are fighting and they're vetoing everything. And it's ruckus meetings in Eastern Kentucky. People are yelling and it's crazy. It's crazy stuff.
Hatfields and McCoys all over
It's
again.
great.
Right?
It's crazy. But being that level of involvement, we're not merely talking about you need to impact the next president of the United States, which is true, but you need to back up and talk about local involvement is not merely who's going to be the mayor, but it's like who's overseeing your school systems and things like that. So it's a little more granular than just being involved in voting for the next congressman.
Yeah,
absolutely.
So another one that I'm thinking paying attention to this next coming year, and some of this I heard on a recent podcast with some statistics that are a lot of it from Barna of generational church attendance, church participation. I think it's relevant for us, all of us being involved on college campuses with young adults. Gen Z is actually going to church, more than other generations. One of the statistics was, I think in 21, the average amount of attendance for Gen Z was once a month at church, and now it's almost twice a month, 1.9 times per month, which is the most of any generation in monthly church attendance. And so it goes against maybe the narrative that we've thought about the last half decade. The data is now showing that there's actually a resurgence in younger generations for attending church. And then you kind of go a level below that we could talk about if we want, is there is a bifurcation, like it's particularly increasing among Gen Z men, and Gen Z women are actually attending church a little bit less, which, trying to parse out the reasons why we probably don't have time to get into. But just in general, I think it's encouraging to see that surge in church attendance. But, we also want to be stewarding those people the right way. And part of that's what we're doing on our campuses. So as you think about that, is that a trend you've watched, or are there things you think might be playing into it and stuff that we could think about on our campuses?
Yeah, it's really fascinating to see. I mean, I'm encouraged. We've been seeing this the last few years, even going back to the Asbury revival sort of things that were happening even before that. And I'm hearing it, and you guys are probably hearing anecdotally on college campuses across the country. And it's really fascinating. I mean, it tells me a couple things. One, I never was a big believer. Progressives believe in the sort of this arc of history is all coming our way. And sometimes conservatives have the opposite, where everything's, slouching toward Gomorrah. And I just feel like history moves in cycles. And even though trend lines look bad, you never know what God is up to and what he's stirring. I think of the 60s and 70s, which, I wasn't alive, but reading about it and my parents' generation, you had so much turmoil in the country. You had Vietnam, you had the sexual revolution, you had Watergate, you had 3 assassinations, you had all this stuff. And yet underneath it, you had this Jesus movement, that nobody saw coming. And I think a similar thing's happening now among young people. And what is encouraging to me is, I think about 5 years ago, the conversation for those of us who have teenage kids was very much, we were nervous that our kids were going to be more progressive than we were, particularly on sexual ethics, because, that's sort of the way the society was going, and it's harder for them than it is for us. And, that was kind of the narrative. And it's interesting how that's totally flipped, that at least in my experience with my kids, of course, they go to a Christian school and we teach them in our home, but my kids are self-consciously conservative. And I think something changed. I think there's a couple things. I think one, the Lord is stirring something among young people, a fervor that is really, really cool to see. But number two, I think the progressive sexual ethics got so extreme, it hit a breaking point, particularly with the transgender movement, where young people were saying, this doesn't make any sense. This is crazy. I also think I want to credit Charlie Kirk. Charlie wasn't perfect and probably said things occasionally that you and I wouldn't say, or we might say it differently. But on the whole, he really encouraged young people that, hey, there's another way to think about these things. And, particularly politically, but then he was starting to talk about Christianity and the
raising your
gospel
family and putting priorities in the right
raising
spot.
your family.
Yeah.
And it really flipped the narrative. I mean, I think of my own kids, they love watching these apologetic videos on YouTube and how to defend your faith. And so it's really cool to see what's happening. And I think, it's up to us to really steward this movement well and keep them away from bad influences and help them understand the scripture and what it is to be a young man or woman of God. This is why I'm such a huge believer in Christian higher education. I mean, I just think to have 4 years to be in this Christian community, to be trained in a Christian worldview, to build relationships, build connections that last for a lifetime. Studies show, if you look at the stuff by like Brad Wilcox, who wrote Get Married, and others, that
Institute
and
for
even the
Family
book,
Studies, I think. Yeah.
The Great De-Churching, that talks about the decline in church attendance. Kids with a college degree. So if you want to look at who attends church, people with 4-year college degrees are more likely to attend church and more likely to get and stay married, which is interesting, right? And we know all the ways that college can go bad and some of the progressive colleges and some of that. But if college is done right, it really sets up kids, I think, not just for their career, which is important, but for their life. It's that kind of 4-year incubated environment where you're getting a Christian worldview, you're building these great relationships, you're learning how to be responsible and manage time and all these things that you're really set up for life. And so I think there's a real opportunity for our institutions of Christian higher ed.
Yeah, there's two things about this generation that just kind of in my head just because of the last month or so. I mean, I just got back from CrossCon. We took 35 students down there, and I was with them, and we sat around one night until almost midnight, sitting just asking questions from everything from transgender to how to engage with their homosexual friends to things like Calvinism and all this other stuff that they always want to ask about. But just to be there with 6,000, this was the second iteration of CrossCon. There were 6,000 kids there. And then the first iteration were 12,000. And at the same time, you've got Passion going on down south with thousands of kids. You had, I think at the same time, the Salt Company conference going on with thousands of people. So there's something there that's encouraging. I don't know what that translates to. I mean, kids like to go to conferences, things like that. We've been doing conferences for a long time. But so that's encouraging at least to see those numbers and to see CrossCon, which is really trying to push people to the nations, to see it growing. Yeah. They're actually moving to St. Louis next year to host it in a foot where the Rams used to play. They're they were turning away thousands of people. So that's encouraging.
That is awesome.
So that's encouraging to see what God may be doing in this generation. But to kind of, you made a comment about people seeing kind of the craziness of the moment and going a different direction. I was at Bethlehem Baptist Church in Minneapolis. I was there for a long time, but I was in the hallway talking to one of the pastors. One of the pastors had been there for a long time, and I made a comment about how crazy the times were. This is insane. Will it ever change? And he said, just off the cuff, he said, what'll probably happen is in 4 or 5 years, people are going to see how crazy these worldviews are, and they will pivot. And he was right. He was right. And I give it a kind of to point to Andrew Walker and some of the stuff he's written on natural law. I think what's happening is natural law is it's being proved, right? This is the way the
Absolutely.
world works, and that's not the way the world works. And people
Yes.
know this via reason.
Yeah.
So I see some of that happening.
Yeah, I agree with you. I'm glad you mentioned that, because I was going to mention natural law too. That God has woven truth into the grain of the universe
Mhm.
and on human hearts. We hear from Romans and other places. So people are saying, when someone says, particularly about the transgender movement, this is just common sense, this doesn't make sense. Well, they're actually talking about natural law without saying it,
Right,
right?
right,
That
right.
there's a way the world works, and this isn't going, and this is the reaction to it, which should tell us, as conservatives, that things are not always totally lost,
Yeah.
and like God is always up to something, and there's always opportunity for renewal. There's always opportunity for revival. And, I think we should embrace the moment we're in. God has made us for this moment. He's not called us 50 years from now or 50 years ago, but right now. And he's doing something. And I'm really excited about young people. I'm around young people all the time, teaching here. And then I have, a college student and 3 teenagers in my home. And the conversations we're having, I actually think Gen Z, particularly the Christians in Gen Z who are serious about the Lord, that are really sharp. They're really sharp. They've grown up in a very confusing time, the age of the internet. I think they understand what's going on, and I think they're going to do some really great things for the Lord. They're very fired up for it. When Charlie Kirk died, it really shook young people, as you know, probably on
Yeah,
your campus.
Yeah.
My
yeah,
son is a senior, and it really shook him. And because he started watching Charlie the last couple years, watching video clips. But what was so cool was it's not like it inspired him to, like, I'm going to take up arms and go to war, but it was like, no, I want to be bold about my faith. I want to be more committed to reading scripture. I want to eventually get married and have children. I mean, those are the things that he really wanted to do. And I think that's a really great sign.
Yeah.
it's good.
So
It's good.
Yeah. I think crazy is a good label. I think the other one is empty. I think a lot of the
Mm-hmm.
worldviews that
yes.
really have been shaking, reality, shaking natural law, they've been tried and they've been found wanting. They've been
Yeah.
found empty. And I think that's the other part, and that's where the church has this great. We're seeing it already, but there's this even longer runway of opportunity. I think where the Spirit's going to work to show people, like, this is your home, like this is where meaning is, this is where hope is, and so that. The last one we were going to touch on is the AI trends, and it plays into it because I think all the other stuff we've talked about, AI has got a lot of cool potential, a lot of neat things. We're all using it in our jobs, I think, and
Right.
but it's also got the potential to be something that consumes so much attention, so much time, can lead people astray if it's not used and stewarded correctly. And it's also going to create a lot of fake environments or a lot of lonely environments where it becomes so isolated, so self-centered in the world that you want to create with it. And so that's where the church is the antidote to that. I mean, that's where we can use some of these tools, but we should be the place where loneliness disappears. We should be the place where ultimate truth is found. And so as you've maybe thought about AI and even talking about it with your kids or seeing how they're using it, I think there's opportunity for the church to thrive within this environment that seems scary and seems unknown of what it's going to look like.
Yeah, I think AI is going to be very disruptive, as every new technology, as the internet was, the printing press, all these kinds of things. And then, as Christians, we have to have a balanced view that we, sometimes Christians can be Luddite and anti-technology. I don't think that's a biblical view, right? I think Tony Reinke's book, God, Technology, and the Christian Life, is really helpful. That, these are, at its core, technology is the act of subduing the earth, taking the raw materials and innovating and creating in the image of an innovating, creative God. And yet we are also in a fallen world, right? And technology can be used for perverted means. It can shape us in distorted ways. And so we have to be wise. And this is why I do think Christians have to be in the conversation to help steward these technologies, right? There's a sort of a view sometimes in Silicon Valley and other places of technology almost as the answer to life. And almost as God, right? You hear people like Peter Thiel and others talking. It's a little scary and Orwellian, right?
Yeah.
So we have to be in these conversations to help shape them and steward them. And I think even with our young people, what are good uses of things like artificial intelligence? In my view, and I haven't fully fleshed this out, but I think there's a way in which our technologies can help eliminate toil, which I think toil is a product of the fall, which is different than work. Work and creative work is a gift from God, but because of the curse, now the ground fights back and it's harder. And so if technology eliminates some toil that allows humans to do even more of the things that only humans can do in terms of creation and innovation, then I think it's a good use, right? And I think, per your loneliness question, this is where the church really has an advantage because, the church emphasizes gathering. We emphasize embodied life, embodied worship. There's something we do on Sundays that is analog and embodied that is, I think, can be a respite and a refresher for people who are digitally exhausted from the rest of the week. And this is why gathering matters so much. And people actually, it's interesting. In a digital age, people are wanting to gather more. If you notice, like they want to gather more. And so I think that's really important, particularly for young people. Young people, I've read a lot of studies where their brains develop best in community. So the more they're with friends, the more they're embodied, the better they do. But if they're isolated and always on screens, that it actually stunts brain development. So I think we have to create those environments for them, which again, thinking about Christian higher education, that's what we're doing, particularly residential education. So.
Okay. Yeah, that's one of the value pieces and things that we are always not what we're just selling, but it's what we're hearing. I mean, that's what people are wanting. They're craving those opportunities. So, well, we're kind of at time. Dan, super appreciate not you just joining us this morning, but the work that you're doing. I'm excited to see what's ahead for the book, and I'm sure the conversations and opportunities you'll have that come from that. And to Jonathan's point, hopefully you can see you on campus sometime in the next year.
We will make it happen.
Well, thank you all for having me. I love the work you're doing there on campus there, and the young men that you're and women that you're molding and shaping for Christian ministry and vocation. Great work.
Yeah. Thanks.
Yeah. All right. Well, Jonathan, you're going to be on the road for a little bit. Serving the country.
But we might be able to squeeze something in. I mean, I've got my own hotel room while I'm there. I'll be at the Holiday Inn Express, so for 6 weeks. So I might be able to sneak something in. We'll see. I'm not sure what to expect. I know I'm going to have to do some PT and things like that. I'll be at the Army. I'm going to be at Fort Jackson, South Carolina with the Army for a few weeks for a school I have to go to, but we'll see what we can sneak in here.
Yeah, we'll have some good chapel speaker guests that we'll pull on, and more faculty and students across campus. So it should be a great spring. We're excited for what's ahead, and again, excited to have 50 episodes, and thankful for Dan joining us this morning. So we will catch you guys next time. Thank you.
Thank you.
All right.